Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Future Salon with John Smart. Welcome, everybody, and I'm so excited. John is sharing Foresight, your hidden superpower. So cool. Please take it away and post the questions that you have in the chat, and I will hard interrupt John if there's an interesting question now. Otherwise, we collect the questions and ask it later. So John, please take it away.
Okay, I'd like to shout out to Miguel and John Robb and Paul Sappho, some friends of mine that I haven't seen in quite some time. Vern Wheelwright, thanks guys for joining. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to be your Foresight colleagues. So, okay, here we go. So we're going to talk today about Foresight and why I think of it as your hidden superpower. I've been writing this book for 7 years. Can you guys see this?
It is real. It is live. Yes. You have it in your head. Marvelous.
Yeah, and it's actually only half of the book. The other half comes out in April of next year, and it's really it's kind of like my little. It's kind of my PhD in foresight done autodidactically. So, you know, an autodidact, someone who just loves learning. Most of us here are that kind of a person. So we get to share our excitement, the things we discover, and then share it onto our network and hopefully make the world a better place. So let me say a little bit about who I am for people who don't know me. I started a little nonprofit in 2003 called the Acceleration Studies Foundation. I'd previously been an entrepreneur, sold a company, got a good exit in test prep and science tutoring, sold it to a company called Princeton Review. Decided what I want to do for my next act. And what I was most interested in was the future. And particularly, I was interested in these things that go faster every year, this subset of things in our world that go faster every year. I want to understand them better because that really seemed to me to be a key part of the future. So I started this little nonprofit, and my background is in business, and then I got a master's in strategic foresight from the oldest of the 27 places where you can get a master's or a PhD in foresight, the University of Houston. And I recommend that program to anyone who's interested in getting a master's. Then I did a couple of years of physiology and medicine, UC San Diego, and then started this complexity research community called Evo Devo Universe. And we published this little book here on the right-hand side, lower right-hand side, in 2019, really asking this basic question in complex systems, which is what's predictable and what's unpredictable. And accelerating change is one of those things that I consider to be statistically predictable. There's a lot of really interesting technology scholars who've studied acceleration in human history. And the really amazing thing is after every catastrophe that has happened to complex systems on Earth, there's been this acceleration of complexity, of network complexity afterwards. So the KT meteorite wipes out most of the species, and then there's this massive and sudden acceleration of morphological and functional complexity in the mammals to create complex organisms like us. The Permian extinction wiped out just about everything on Earth, and then again, the same thing happened afterwards. Obviously, the major catastrophes that have affected us have also caused accelerating complexity. The most famous being the Dark Ages in Rome, after the collapse of Rome. For 1,000 years, a lot of big picture technology things didn't make progress. And, you know, we had a very strong monotheism in Europe holding down large scale technological change. But then we had all these folks doing small scale technological advances everywhere. We had water wheels like exponentiating across Europe. The Benedictine monks were running around practicing what they called the useful arts, teaching all this small scale, what we call today appropriate technology, and all these little communities right in the middle of the dark ages. So this acceleration, it's just seems to be baked into how human experience, baked into the nature of the human experience. And so studying that led me to foresight. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I've got these two books. The first is Foresight Practices, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. And the second book is this big picture stuff, and that's futures, those stories about the futures. You may or may not agree with those stories, but those are really the two main things in the foresight space. There's foresight practices and methods, and then there's these future stories that we tell that hopefully are based in evidence, have good argument behind them, and have a good probability of coming true. So the first thing we need to say about foresight is that it's practiced in these 6 domains. So self-foresight, obviously, personal foresight, what we know about ourselves, our emotional intelligence, the way we, whether we accept ourselves or not, and our self-leadership. There's this beautiful book I mentioned in the Foresight Guide by a beautiful series of books by a guy named Albert Ellis. If you've heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, Albert Ellis developed something called rational emotive behavior therapy. And I consider the best form of cognitive behavioral therapy because REBT focuses on self-acceptance and the truth that most of us kind of don't think we're good enough for the world. We have this imposter syndrome, and we have something called akrasia, which the Greeks talked about. It's the way that we fight our own foresight. We generate a plan, and then we don't actually execute on it. And we don't do that because we have a set of beliefs that either we're not good enough for the plan, or we're not going to actually execute the plan. That there's something about ourselves that keeps us from executing that. And REBT is a kind of therapy. You can do it as self-therapy, you can do it as group therapy, and it really improves your self-foresight. And I list the 2 best books on REBT that I know in the guide. And so that's an example of self-foresight. Then there's team foresight, how we relate to each other, to our families, and the social intelligence involved with that. And there's organizational foresight, which is what most people think of when they hear the term foresight consulting, the way we help organizations plan better for managing and leading the future. Then there's societal foresight and global foresight. These are the things that we all argue about on Reddit Futurology, where we're all just trading stories and ideas and models and worldviews of the future. And then there's universal foresight, and that's the science, philosophy, and complex systems thinking that we use to describe how the world actually works, how the universe appears to work. And so a fun question for each of you would be, which of these 6 domains do you tend to think about the most? And a related question is, which of these 6 do you think you most need to improve? Now, for me, it was team and self. Those are the 2 I really needed to work on. So I've actually got a lot on both of those in the Foresight Guide, because for me, it was a journey recognizing all the ways that I block my own personal foresight. And at the same time, I started to study the psychology of foresight, and I learned that our brains are actually built by natural selection to constantly think about the future. But the catch is we do it for the next few minutes, and it's mostly unconscious. And so bringing that unconscious, constant predictive processing, it's called the predictive processing model of mind, bringing that unconscious foresight conscious is really one of the big things we can do in self-foresight. It makes us more effective. And then we can also, with our teams and our interactions with others, we can name things that are kind of hidden that we're not discussing, and we can very gently and ethically and empathically bring those out and then help the team generate better foresight, for the next day, the next week, the next quarter. And that's how we step our way to the longer term foresight. And,
John,
that
John,
question.
Two things. Number one, there's a request for you to just define foresight. What is it for you? I mean, you gave the
Foresight is how we look to and analyze the future. So there's three fundamental modes of thinking, temporal modes: hindsight, insight, and foresight, past, present, and future.
Okay.
And one of the really great things we learned when we studied the psychology of foresight, and here's probably the best single book on it, The Psychology of Thinking About the Future, came out 2 years ago. It's got about 30 academics who've written really interesting findings in psychology on how we think about the future. But one of the really most interesting things is when we think about the future, it's very easy to daydream. And when we think about the past, it's very easy to reminisce and get sucked in nostalgia. But the real beauty of past, present, and future, of balancing those, is we can use past thinking and future thinking in service to the present. And if we're doing that, if we're constantly closing the loop and of that temporal loop and asking ourselves, is this time travel to the past or the future? Does it serve the present? Am I organizing my past and future thinking in a way that improves my foresight and action in the present? The plan that I have for today, for tomorrow, for the next quarter. If I'm doing that, then I'm balanced. And so that's a really interesting kind of meta question to ask when we're traveling to the past or the future, or when we're focused on the present. It's very easy to spend too much time in any of those three.
Okay.
Another thing we should think about when we think about the future is realize there's this power law of future thinking. So most of our future thinking is less than 24 hours, and it's mostly unconscious. Like I said, it's minutes ahead into the future. Sometimes it's just seconds ahead. And there's these beautiful studies that have shown that if you show a video of a dog quacking, and you put it in an EEG recorder, you discover that they are instantly unconsciously surprised, because they're constantly predicting unconsciously what that dog is going to do when they're looking at the video. Right. And then about a half second to a full second later, they consciously recognize surprise. So what that tells us is that we're constantly at below the level of consciousness itself, just in our basic thinking and feeling, we're constantly making intuitive guesses about the future. And then we aggregate those and we argue over the different perspectives we have in the theater of the conscious mind. So it's an amazing machine, this brain that we have. It's constantly thinking ahead. And one of the key takeaways from seeing this power law is if most of our future thinking is between now and our next loss of consciousness, now and bedtime. One of the most interesting things is, how do I make that better? Because if I make that better, then I can step my way down. I can make tomorrow's thinking better. I can make the next weeks, the next quarters, etc. And most of us are evaluated on short-term and mid-term foresight. Short-term we define as the T's, tomorrow to the next 3 months. Starts with a T, right? Right. And then mid-term is the fours, the next quarter to the next 4 years, or election cycle. And then long-term is anything longer than an election cycle. So it's a really easy way to see these kind of 4 horizons. Now, most of us don't need to spend, maybe we're going to spend 5% of our thinking at most about the future in that long-term space. But if it's high quality, that's enough. And the way we get better long-term thinking is we don't just jump to the long-term. We focus in on what we're going to do today. And there's a book I want to share with you called Indistractable. This may be my single best share for tonight, by Nir Eyal. It's a very popular book. It's kind of trending now. And why it's trending is because he's talking about focus but he's talking about it from a foresight perspective. What he says is, don't be task list first, be schedule first. Because if you make a schedule with at least 2 time boxes on it for tomorrow. Now, a time box is, of course, a start and the ending time for something you're going to do. Then you can actually predict how much you're going to get done in that time box. And at the end of the time box, you can look at it and say, well, what did I get what I wanted done? If not, what were my distractions? How can I improve my next time box? But if you actually go through the trouble of making a schedule and living schedule first, the first thing you do when you wake up is you look at that schedule. And then after you know what your time boxes are, you look at your task list and you rearrange things. And you guys know how it works. You start a thing on a task list, and then a fire comes up, and you got to spend all that time putting out the fire. And at the very best, you get like 1 or 2 things on your task list done. But the beauty of being scheduled first is you know that next time box coming up, okay, put it all down. I'm going to jump into that time box. At least I'm going to start on that new thing. I'm going to see how much I can get done on that thing inside of that time box. And what you end up getting are these, it's just like the start of every new day. Every time you get into one of those, you actually can look ahead, see what you want to get done, predict how much you're going to get done, and then review it at the end. And that kind of, it's called a do loop. That kind of looking ahead, doing, and then reviewing is the fundamental way that we adapt. It's called a perceive, decide, act, feedback, PDAF cycle in cognitive science. So this book is a really useful way of helping you realize that, you know, those people who are so good at planning on a daily basis and getting things done, those are the people you want to give the longer term problems to, because even if they can't think well about the future, they'll find someone who can. They'll get that project done, and they'll deliver the foresight, analysis or strategy recommendation or whatever it is that you need. Yeah.
Two questions. Number one, Tad is asking whether it's similar to Deep Work by Cal Newport.
Yes, it is. It is similar. The beauty of Cal's perspective is that he's a computer scientist, so it's also really tied in. Cal's stuff is also really tied into this this fundamental cognitive science action cycle. And I also recommend Cal's book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, which deals with that fundamental question of, do you start with a passion or a mastery in your career? And he recommends, you're going to think you want to start passion first, but start with your mastery, figure out what you can get paid for that you're already good at, and then bridge your way into a passion and test that passion out. Because it may be a passion in the short term, but until you've done it a few times, you won't really necessarily know. Another book I really love on this topic is A Peak by Anders Ericsson, the master of deliberate practice. How do you get really, really good if you're a violin player or an athlete, really, really good at something? You do what's called deliberate practice. And that means setting up things that are at the edge of your discomfort and having somebody who's an expert review your performance and failing 1 out of every 3 tries. 70% of the time you should be succeeding and 30% failing. And if you can do that, you actually are close to a flow state in psychology. You're not actually in the flow state, you're actually in an uncomfortable state trying to get into flow. And this book, Peak, describes all these beautiful routines for really getting good at something. It's very similar to Cal's perspective in Deep Work.
And Sam has some good questions. Number one, when others ask me to be 100% present, that doesn't mean anything to me, does it to you?
No, you absolutely don't want to be 100% present.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so unfortunately, who's that who asked that question?
Sam,
I got to jump into the first slide in the backups, and there's this 18 question test you can take, Sam, at mindtime.com. and it'll tell you whether you're a past, present, or a future thinker. And the beauty of this is, if you look at these pyramids here, I am actually, the middle of that is 33% future, 33% past, 33% present, right? You know, a third of the time you're thinking hindsight, insight, foresight. And I myself tend to be future first, past second, present third. Present is the one I have to try and get better at. I'll spend a little too much time for my own good in the future. But the point here is that you need all three of these types. Present thinkers, they excel at getting things done. Future thinkings, they can be good at what needs to get done. And past thinkers will tell you what has worked so far. And if you really value all three of those, then your past and future thinking is going to be in service to the present. You're going to be going into it, organizing it to make your present more useful and more internally driven. If you're thinking in all three of these domains is externally driven, you're just reactive. If you are internally choosing what you do with your hindsight, insight, and foresight, then you're on top of this. And this 18-question test at mytime.com will really help you see kind of the value of all three of these kinds of thinking. All right, we should move a little faster so we get through these slides. I got 22 slides here, and we're not going to get them all done. All right. So there's the 4 horizons. I've tried to make the pitch that getting better at today's is the fastest way to get short and midterm, to get good at those 2, which are really the most important for most of our evaluations. Then there's these 3 fundamental ways we look to the future: the possible, the probable, and the preferable. And the really interesting thing, and these were first presented by a futurist named Alvin Toffler in a book called Future Sock in 1970. And the really beautiful thing about these is there's 2 kinds of physics in the universe. There's a physics of what can happen, of what's possible, and quantum mechanics and chaos theory, almost everything in the domain of the very small. And then there's a physics of the probable, and we have these very large, we have general relativity, we have thermodynamics, these very large scale effects that are predictable, highly predictable. And those 2 don't talk to each other. Those 2 types of physics do not talk to each other. There's people in quantum gravity who are trying to make them talk to each other. We don't know how to do it. And somehow those 2 types of physics created this third amazing thing, life, which alone has preferences. And it didn't, and as far as we can tell, it didn't happen immediately in the universe. It took a few billion years, right? So these are 3 really foundational ways of looking at change: what could happen, what's likely to happen, and what we want to happen. And since that model was advanced, people have said things like, well, there's actually 3 management groups around these 3 thinking skills. You have people in leadership, strategy, analysis, and planning, and they're seeing landscapes, adaptive landscapes, peaks and valleys on any axis that you care about, any selective variable. Then you have people more fundamentally looking to the future, people who are kind of in the possibility space, and they're seeing these trees of possibilities branching out. You got your innovators, your ideators, your designers, your entrepreneurs. And then opposing them, you've got these probable future people like the forecasters, finance, risk management, legal, security, and they're seeing these funnels, they're seeing constraints. And these people are all kind of arguing with each other. They're all valuable, fundamental concepts in management. And then we have to add sentiment. There's something called dual process theory. Danny Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, was one of the great books on this that popularized this dual process model of mind, that we feel first and strongest, and then we think second and weaker. So we intuit rapidly about the future and emotionally, and then we deliberate slower and secondary, right? And so how do we intuit? Well, the two fundamental ways we intuit are we have a strategic optimism about the future, and we have a defensive pessimism. And who do you think lives longer, the strategic optimist or the defensive pessimist?
Strategic optimists.
Yeah, they live about 10% less long.
Really?
Yeah. Who do you think gets more done? The strategic optimists. They get more done in the corporate environment. Who's more accurate in predicting the future of a corporate project? The defensive pessimists, again. So there's tremendous value to both of these ways of thinking. And I give you the studies in my book. It's really fascinating. The defensive pessimists, they don't burn the candle at both ends. They have better insurance. They're just kind of careful and constrained and cautious. And that's really valuable. And so are the people that set the stretch goals and say, jump into the breach and let's see if it works, right? These are two fundamentally useful ways of thinking. And then there's this third thing called realism. And realism isn't realpolitik. It's not the kind of a cynicism or a situational ethics like some connotations of realism. Realism in the psychology standpoint from folks like Dileep Jest here in his book Wiser, realism from a psychological, from a sentiment perspective, is actively balancing optimistic and pessimistic thinking. You're flipping back, you're looking at that glass and you're flipping back and forth, half full, half empty, just like those weird things where you can see the faces or the outline of the vase, right? Face is vase, face is vase. That's realism in Jest's perspective. And what's the benefit of being able to do these three? Well, this woman, Gabrielle Oettingen, wrote this beautiful book, started her research in 2010. And this book, Rethinking Positive Thinking, she did all these randomized clinical trials, and she showed that if you're making a plan for the day and you think optimistically about that plan, and then you spend about the same amount of time thinking of all the ways that plan might fail based on your past behavior and the situations that you're in, and then you make a plan, and the plan has a if then statement. If this problem comes up, this is what I'm going to try and do to overcome it. You get three things. You get 50 to 100% less prediction error. You get 30 to 150% more productivity in the time box. And you get greater motivation to overcome obstacles. She didn't quantitate that third benefit, but she gave all these examples in her book. And she did this with a whole pile of things. She did it with academic performance, with relationships, behavior change, weight loss, diet, and high stress work. And if you go to whoopmylife.org, you can see her little model for how you do this optimism, pessimism plan. She actually showed that if you start with pessimism first and then optimism and then plan, you get 50% less prediction accuracy and 50% less productivity. So you cut your accuracy and productivity in half. That's how bad it is to start first with the negative. And it's so amazing. So we developed a little model based on SWOT at our little consultancy called ADOR analysis. And if you know what SWOT is, instead of SWOT, we recommend you do ADOR when you are doing a strategic assessment, okay? And what is ADOR? First, you scan externally for advantage. What are all the benefits relative to your strategy that everybody else is getting that you're not getting? That's called advantage scanning, okay? And that forces you to see all the good things happening in the world that are not happening to you. Then you look for disruptions. And those are forced changes that are happening to somebody, and they're actually good for some people and bad for others. So you think about this massive disruption of COVID, and you think of all the people who've benefited from it. That's an example of a massive disruption that is bad for a lot of people, for most people, in fact, but it has some upsides as well. And after you've done those two external scans, then you evaluate your personal opportunity and your personal risk. And that's ADOR, okay? And
John, little time check,
Yep.
6:40, so 22, I think we started a little bit late, so 20 to 30 minutes.
okay,
Time.
so thanks. So in my book, I describe something called negativity bias. And it turns out that, you know, our media and many orgs and teams and some individuals, we start first with the negative. We think first about disruption and risk, and then externally, and then only after that do we think about personal opportunity and systemic advantage. And this degrades our foresight capacity by at least 50%. And there's this beautiful book here, The Power of Bad, came out last year, which it talks about this they call it the negativity effect, how it rules us and how we can use it, how we can transcend it and use it to our advantage. So you can be ADOR focused or you can be DROA focused, and most of our media and culture is DROA focused. So there's a real cost to that. So I have this exercise in the appendix of the book called Grasp Thinking, and it's basically Oettingen's WHOOP model, but I've synthesized it with something called GROW from the 1970s that I think you guys might enjoy. So the last piece we have to add to this is the classic foresight pyramid is now called the modern foresight pyramid, because in 2020, a colleague of mine named Art Shostak came up with the 4 Ps, and he said, yeah, we have possible, probable, and preferable, but the truth is, because we feel first, optimistically and pessimistically, when we think about the preferable, ideally we want to think about what we want and what we want to prevent, and in that order and roughly the same amount. So that gives us the 4 Ps, probable, possible, preferable, and preventable. And that also gives us the 4 types of people who are fighting each other on teams when we're thinking about the future. We got the anticipators, we have the innovators, and they're focused on the environment. And then the people who are focused on our strategy are the optimists and the pessimists. And all 4 of those 2 conflicts, the bottom conflict is called predictive contrasting, and the top conflict is called sentiment contrasting. And those are the fundamental conflicts. Now, any of you who work on teams in organizations should know about the TKI, which is a conflict management diagnostic, and it'll tell you which of these 5 types of conflict management you like to do. And we want to get in the upper right corner when we can, which is the collaborating kind of conflict management. And the beauty of this model is it says that you don't want to minimize conflict to get better results. You want to maximize trusted conflict. And if you think about all the past times you've made important life decisions and you've really agonized over them beforehand, and you've really generated a lot of honest conflict, trusted conflict with yourself and with others in your network, you get a better decision. So you get a higher performance when you have higher level of trusted conflict. That's one of the big insights. And this book, The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson at Harvard, gives you all the data for why that's so true, okay? There's an older book called The Speed of Trust that I also recommend on that. And so that term is called, the way you get that, the term in psych literature is called psychological safety. And Edmondson talks about how you do this on a team, okay? And my wife was part of this study at Google of 100,000 people at Google, and they found top managers, the #1 thing they gave to their teams to get better performance was psych safety. Psychological safety is #1, trusted conflict of the right type, okay? There's also an assessment called the KAI you can take that'll tell you where you sit on the anticipator, the innovator, and what he calls the bridger, which is the strategist axis of these 4 types. And finally, there's an assessment that David Keirsey did called the Keirsey temperament profile. And this is a 70-question test you can take for free that will tell you whether you're an idealist, a rational, a guardian, or an artisan. And these terms correlate very closely with the 4 Ps, okay? And many of us are one or two of these. There's one or two of these that we just like to do more. And the point that Kiersey makes is you really need all of these on a team. You need your idealists, your rationals, your guardians, and your artisans. And the idealists are going to fight the rationals, and the guardians are going to fight the artisans. These are fundamental conflicts that you see on all teams, okay? Finally, there's a book by Steenkamp that came out 2 years ago that uses the old Isaiah Berlin categories of fox and hedgehog for probable and possible. And then a new category he calls the eagle, which integrates the two. And then a fourth category of leader called the ostrich. All of us know the ostrich leader. And what he shows is you can be an ostrich, and as long as you can delegate to an eagle, a fox, or a hedgehog, you will get a lot of great work done, okay? So it's a beautiful book, Time to Lead, I recommend it. And finally, these classic foresight methods you see here are preferred by different kinds of leaders. A fox leader, a hedgehog leader, or an eagle leader will like these different methods. And the point is not one method is better than all the others. The point is all corners of this pyramid matter. You really need to balance all of these because in different contexts, each corner is going to be useful, okay? So how do we do foresight? First, we assess the environment with predictive contrasting. Then we create strategy with sentiment contrasting. Both involve conflict. And which of these two conflicts do we value more? All of us value sentiment contrasting, tend to value sentiment contrasting more. So we often will skip predictive contrasting. We won't do enough thinking about what's likely and what could. Or if we do those two, we'll tend to do one of them more than the other. And they're really both really important. That's the idea. So I've got 3 like fun slides for you. We talk about personal foresight. You know, for the last 5 years of writing this book, I've become an investor. I've really decided to focus on thinking about how I can get more financial independence for myself and my family. And I have been truly amazed to see the gains that we're seeing in some of these superstar stocks or so-called unicorn stocks over the last 10 years, actually, right? The 10-year leading average of the stock market is between 9 and 12%, right? It's really just gone up. That's the whole stock market. Then the leaders have gone up well beyond that. Here you can see what Google has done just in the last 12 months, and Apple, Facebook, Netflix, etc. NVIDIA, 75%. If you're in any of these companies, you know, you've seen some major, what they call a K-shaped recovery, right? Where people who are in the market or people who have real estate have increased their net assets, while the majority of us have either gone sideways or have seen an erosion of our personal assets. And this is a big problem that we need to address on a social level, and I talk about it a lot in the second book. But what I want to do is I want to give you a thought here. Most of the rules in our government, in our plutocracy today, are really oriented to big companies and to the wealthy, right? We have a very extractive healthcare system. We have a very expensive higher education system. We have a very gerrymandered and limited political voting power. And yet there's a few of these kind of exceptions. And here's one. It's called the Roth IRA. So the Roth IRA is a particular form of retirement that is tax sheltered, and you can put up to $7,000 a year into it. And I only discovered as I started researching it a few years ago that you can actually set one up for your kids starting at the age that you pay them an allowance. So if you have any children, you can go to Fidelity or Schwab, set up a so-called custodial Roth IRA, and you can put $6,000 a year, tax sheltered forever, into that account, and you can trade it as actively or passively as you want, and you don't report any of the gains or losses to the IRS because it's completely tax sheltered. Does that make sense? So what can you do with that? Well, you can act like a venture capitalist, and you can pick a single stock and put all of your money into that stock one year and then a different one the next year. And if that stock is a winner, if it makes any significant returns, what is that going to look like when your child retires? Well, here's an example. If you put 100,000, 100 a week into that, just 5,000 a year, and invest in your growth stock, the 10-year trailing market return, I was wrong, is 15% right now. It was historically 9%. Now it's 15 today. At 30, your kid's Roth will be growing 300,000 a year at the age of 30. Okay. At the age of 43, it'll be growing $1 million a year. At 57, it'll be growing $4 million a year. Okay. And that's called the snowball. Warren Buffett, in his fantastic book, The Snowball, the single best investing book I want to recommend to you. It's the history of this guy's life and how he discovered the value of compound interest. And it's why Berkshire Hathaway is now the 10th most valuable company in the New York Stock Exchange, right? The only company that's basically a holding company, right? If you realize the power of investing, which means clothing yourself in a good company with good management, then you will capture some of that exponential value creation that's happening all around us. And you'll create some financial independence for yourself and your kids. And here's the most important thing: that little curve you see at the bottom of that slide, it's going to look like that money is going to do nothing for the first 20 years, and in the next 20 years, it's going to completely outperform what you expect. And that's the nature of exponentials. We always underestimate what they'll do early on, and overestimate what they'll do early on, and underestimate the second half of those curves. And eventually, legislators are probably going to take away this Roth. They're going to cap it, right? But right now, it's completely uncapped, and it's a completely open field for putting, maximizing your contribution every year, and teaching financial literacy to your kids, and really getting really your investments out competing, unless you're an entrepreneur, out competing everything else you're going to do. So it's a pretty interesting thing. It's being abused right now. Folks like Peter Thiel put all of their pre-IPO stock in Roth. It probably should be illegal, but that's what they're doing. So what do you think Peter Thiel's Roth is worth today? North of $1.5 billion. Wow. A single retirement account. Now that's complete abuse, right? Obviously, but I've just told you here how you can have a $36 million tax-free Roth if you were making 20% return a year. You say, well, John, I can't make 20% return a year. Well, the folks at Motley Fool have been doing that for the last 27 years. Okay, and for $95, you can get their stock advisory, which is going to give you once a month a recommendation of up to 5 stocks that you might buy. So you only go into the market once a month and then pick 1 or 2 of those stocks, invest a little bit of your money in it, and that's it, right? And so it's called passive investing, where you're not constantly tracking the market. You're just looking for these companies that look very well managed, that have a lot of growth, a lot of optionality to them. And some countries really push their people to be in the market. Australians do it through their superannuation funds. So the Australians retire a lot richer than Americans do, right? Because the system is actually rigged for them to take advantage of that, where in America, you have to make that choice yourself. And I'm trying to argue the value of that. So the last thing I want to suggest to you is, here's a company. I just invested all of my money in it from my Roth for this year. It's called Joby, and they're a little company based in Monterey, California, but they've already got $1.5 billion of investment. They've got major partners with Toyota as their manufacturing partner, and they are planning to solve urban gridlock for cities over the next 20 years with these little flying taxis. And they're going to have a human safety driver in them for the first 10 years, and then they're going to be autopiloted after that. And you think, well, John, that can't work. That's going to be noisy. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be dangerous. They've solved every single problem. Just look at a couple of the YouTube videos. They're 100 times quieter than a helicopter. They go 200 miles an hour, and they're going to be $2 a passenger mile because they take 5 passengers and one pilot currently. And they're going to start launching in 4 cities 2 years from now. And it's going to cost you to go from JFK to downtown Manhattan, $35, and you'll get there in 10 minutes. And that's how they're going to start. They're going to roll out from there, and then these little things are going to be going everywhere. And this solves gridlock. You cannot solve it with self-driving cars. You cannot, because there's people who just drive more, and you cannot solve it with high-speed rail because no one can dig the tunnels that fast. They're too expensive. So what are you going to do over the next 50 years? This is the solution. And these things are going to scale like crazy. Now, that's just a prediction. I'm just making, like a venture capitalist, I'm suggesting, and you can say, John, is that going to be another Tesla? And I'm going to say to you, no, it's going to be bigger than Tesla because people aren't going to be buying Teslas. They're just going to be using these things at $2 a passenger mile. So this is bigger. This is an Uber plus a Tesla. Now, Tesla went up 41 times its value over the first 10 years. From the Roadster to the next, to the Model 3, this could go up, 50 times its value over the next 10 or 15 years. So
I still think that the noise, even if it's 100 times lower, you don't want to have all these things buzzing around. I mean,
yeah, we're going to see what'll happen. It's going to launch in Miami, in New York, in San Francisco, and in Los Angeles simultaneously. It's going to start in all the existing helicopter pads. Then it's going to just scale from there. And it's all going to depend on whether all those problems that I told you have been solved.
Right.
And if it's taking off from a 5-story or higher building, you will not hear it on the ground. And you will not hear it in the air. Just go and listen to any of they actually record the loudness and compare it to everything else that's in the sky right now. Just go and listen to one of those. They can make them silent. They can make them silent at 3,000 feet. So these are really fascinating questions, right? And this is a bet. This is just a bet we're making on the future. And what I would like to suggest to you guys is make one of those bets every year. Look ahead, see what could be coming. Think of the optionality of all these amazing new things that are happening, and say, well, that looks like a really interesting future, and I'm going to see whether it'll happen or not. And I'm going to actually have some skin in the game. So thank you guys for letting me go over all these things with you. No parking on streets, always in motion. John Robb.
And can you stop the sharing so that we see you full feed?
Yes.
Excellent.
So the interesting thing about self-driving cars, from what I've read, John Robb, there's a beautiful study from UC Berkeley that basically says there's just going to be a whole lot more usage of them, even though you need less of the cars because they're constantly going like trains. The usage goes up so much when you don't have to drive, that you're back to gridlock or back to metered, where they're going to charge you based on a time of use in order to stop gridlock, because you only get 2.5 times more density than you would with the existing cars. So it's not a panacea. The only solution that really allows scale and density in a city are these like ant trails in the sky that are basically auto assigned by the software, and they just go higher and higher and higher.
But
Well,
what about,
let me take a one swing at that, right?
Yeah, go for it.
So you go electric, autonomous, fleet vehicles, on demand, like we're already jumped there.
Yep.
But once you go to fleet vehicles, then you go to single occupancy, because right now we're focused on the sedan, which is a multi-use car. So it has to be good on the weekends as well as your commute. Right. Single occupancy is a small format. You can fit 4 cars in the existing space.
Yeah.
Right.
And the
also
problem I see with transportation futures, urban transportation is such a fantastic like test case for our foresight. It's fun for us to argue this, right? The problem I see with any changes in the transportation mix is human behavior. People don't want to change. We're going to stay this car-centric, ownership-centric model for as long as we can until it's pried out of our hands. And this particular approach, what's so amazing about this approach is they will have fleets and they'll have personal. And it'll start fleet. These things start at $1.5 million, but their long-term plan is to get them down under $300,000, and you will be using them as fractional ownership, the way they use, airplane shares today, and communities will have them, and then they'll go to personal, and you're going to be allowed. The FAA guidelines are, if you have 5 acres or more, you're going to be able to land them on your property out in the boonies, right? So everybody who has a ranch property who's going out on the weekend doesn't even need to have one of these vertiports. They're just going to take them, and they are not flying them. That's the most amazing thing. The AI is flying it, and the AI, as you probably know, it's a whole lot easier. I can't give you a number, but it's tremendously easier to do sense and avoid in the air than it is on the ground. So that's why that
been that way for
scale faster.
Been that way for a while.
First. What?
No, I mean, it's been that way for a while. I mean, AI flying is better, but I mean, it's FAA kills things. I mean, killed the drone industry. Drone delivery was killed by the FAA. It's risk averse. I mean, it's the same kind of thing as if the FCC had stopped dial-up modems from going on POTS. Right.
That's right.
Copper wires right back in the 94.
So as an investment, you have to look at it from a global perspective and say, is this a solution that's so valuable that it just has to exponentiate? It might not do it first in America, or first in passenger, but it has to. Now, because these guys have been Air Force certified, their airframe has been Air Force certified for 2 years. My belief is it has to emerge as air transport for military in America, and it has to emerge globally in some countries, as I'm sure you well know, Singapore, Dubai, China, they're all deeply bought into this model, where, as you say, the FAA has to certify, they have to certify next year this airframe, which has 1,000 flight hours, right? They have to certify that airframe. But my argument is, even if that doesn't happen on the timeline we're talking about, I think this investment is one of those inevitables, because it makes cities so much more effective. And that's just a question we have to ask, if that's true or not, right? It's a really fun question.
I like it as an investment. I just don't see it replacing the autonomous car. And once it goes fleet, once it starts to, I mean, look at, if you drive through New York, and I've done a lot recently. I mean, the big thing that stops you on any kind of traffic is that the parking, right? There's parking on these. Once that's gone, once those double parks, it really does flow fast. And then you change the format, it goes. I just see this fleet approach changing the format, always in motion.
I think it's a both and future. I think both of those are both your model and my vision are both going to happen. I think you're right, and it's really fun to ask that question, right?
Right.
And I think a monocoque where you're enclosed like a motorcycle that is self-balancing, all of a sudden a single, or even you can have two, one behind the other. You can have easily 3, 4, 5, and then much more throughput through that model. I think there's enormous opportunity.
Yeah, a
There
single
is
occupancy car does the same thing, except they have a bubble around you that protects you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
I think there is, Mark, but I would argue that that particular future comes later. It comes after the self-driving vision of the four-wheel vision. I personally think that. Now, I've seen the incredible efficiency of these two-wheel, these incredibly dense schools of fish, these two-wheel scooters in Vietnam and other parts of Asia. So I can see that vision. The question is, when does that come? Does that come early, or does that come after you solve things like self-driving and air delivery? And what are the highest value things that are going to be solved first? And I think this ability for us to get anywhere in the city is going to be the one that's going to happen very soon. So I think over the next 5 years, we're finally going to see this thing take off. And if you look at where Tesla was in 2010, nobody believed electrification was going to be the dominant thing 10 years later. Now everybody's on board. And this right now, this is something most people look at this skeptically and say, no, it's not going to happen, right? Or it's not going to happen anytime soon. And that's a really interesting question, right? Is if that flips, then the value of this whole platform, people are going to start seeing all the different areas where it's going to start changing society. So interesting questions.
So John, I agree with you that this is going to be a very valuable future technology. I do know that is not the only company that's doing it. I believe Google and a bunch of the other tech companies also have invested in these types of aerial vehicles.
Yeah.
And I also
Yes.
would say that there's
point.
another dimension where you go underground. And like I was thinking about the Boring Company, once you get fully autonomous vehicles, underground travel becomes a lot more attractive as well.
Absolutely. And I would argue that that's the future that comes after this. I would argue that because it's expensive, you're going to see this scale for at least 3 decades, and then you'll start to see that other one scale. But what happens in that first generation, right? That's the interesting question for me, for the investment of, say, what I want to invest in right now that's on the verge of everyone seeing, because I think the Boring Company and that high-speed rail model is a tremendous solution for the long term.
And
Totally agree with you. And there's 130 companies in this space, so you have to pick a few winners, right? There's 130, and my argument is these guys, there's only 3 companies that have solved the noise problem that I can tell.
Right.
And so now you're down to a much smaller number. And like Mark said, he went right to that noise problem first, right? It's the first thing that irritates us, and it's what makes small communities not want to have airports, right? There's this long history of you have to get things down to a level where people will accept the noise, the safety, whatever other issues are there. And at a certain point, it just becomes, no, it's just such a great benefit. I need to have one of these vertiports in my neighborhood, drive my car to it, take the elevator five stories up, and then boom, I'm across the city, right?
So what are the main exponentials you're looking at? Like right now, with all the tech revolutions we're going through right now, what are the exponentials that you are going, wow?
I will send you a proof of my second book, because they're in that, and it's a very rough draft. And if anyone wants to email me, john@foresight-u.com, I'll send you a very rough proof of that. And basically, it comes down to 2 things: densification and dematerialization. And these are academic terms. They're kind of clunky, ugly academic terms for what accelerating change is.
Okay, so give us your top month? 3.
Yep.
Sorry.
Roth,
it's a virtual
John.
middle class. It's virtualizing all of the middle class lifestyle.
There you go.
And I laid it all out, just all the details about how this could be, but it's going to be forced, because the only climate change model that we've ever seen that actually worked was last year during COVID, and everyone's minds are focused on, okay, how do we replicate that? But with AR, with synthetic meats, with
that's it, my friend.
Autonomous driving.
Anything. Yeah, synthetic meats vastly dematerialize the whole food chain and the whole resource impact chain. I have a single podcast to recommend to everyone. It's called Danny in the Valley. Danny Fortson. He writes for the Sunday Times. Beautiful podcast. Danny in the Valley. and it goes into a lot of this stuff. You'll love this guy. He's really one of us. He's a futurist. And yeah, he did the whole synthetic meat thing. Dematerialization, there's two kinds of dematerialization. When you substitute information for atoms, and when you substitute computation for a physical process. Okay? And both of them are just accelerating like crazy. And there's two kinds of densification, where you bring things closer together in space and in terms of matter, energy, space, or time. That's, the flying taxi thing, right? Tying the cities together, more tightly as one, kind of, simultaneous real-time system, and miniaturization. So you can localize or you can miniaturize. If you can substitute a nanotechnological process for what was meso or human scale, then you get this massive densification. And so that's D&D. We played D&D in high school. D&D is what drives accelerating change. If you can see localization, miniaturization, or virtualization, or informationalization, you can see any of those four things, then you're seeing really a key part of the future, and whatever platforms are delivering the highest value with those things, they're the big investments that are just going to be, they're going to continue to outperform the market, man. They're going to continue to do this. This is often called pre-singularity investing, right? It's like, what are the things that really capture that accelerating value creation? And how do you actually describe value? It's a fascinating question. I try and wrestle with this in my second book. I'll send anyone who wants a copy of it. Tell me what I'm missing, because it's not coming out until end of Q1 next year.
I would like to give the stage to Gillian, who has had a question a while ago, actually another one recently. So Gillian, ask your question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Jillian. John, thanks for all this. It's really stimulating and fascinating.
Thank you.
I guess, well, I have another thought, actually. I'll tell you the first one in a minute, but I was just connecting the dots to something else that I've done recently. But I'm wondering, I'm thinking about the phenomenon, like people don't, they don't commute distances, they commute time, right? So like when you raise the speed limit, you get more sprawl, right? Or when when you widen the freeway, you just attract more traffic, right?
Absolutely.
So like I'm thinking about like those dynamics and like how that will happen.
Well, remember, you're substituting. You have substitution behavior though once it's self-driving, where if we can accept the 22 minutes of the average commute, well, maybe what we're doing now in a self-driving situation is we're accepting 22 minutes of downtime. But what if most of that time we're actually doing something productive when we're in the car? Then the 22 minutes of downtime might end up being, we might end up going 200 miles, right?
Yeah, or it might turn out that it's not time exactly, but it's like some sort of mental energy that it takes to drive, or you know what I mean? Like, those things might translate.
Exactly. And so if there's a cognitive overhead to it, exactly.
I can't wait for the sleeping car that gently drives me to LA to my meeting through the night.
Yes.
And then stops at a 24-hour either fitness or whatever, where I can take a shower and refresh and then be ready for the meetings I have. And then
our friend Tyler here
somebody should build that
in a startup called Fleet Bus that tried to do that.
Yeah.
And COVID hit
between LA and San Francisco. And it really comes down a lot to Jillian's point of cognitive overhead and behavior change, right? If it requires a behavior change on the part of people, then the value proposition's got to be really compelling, unless the AI is taking care of it all for you. And that's what's happening with these on-demand networks, is that it's going to become more and more of an actual plug-in. One of the things, Tyler, that sold me on Joby is they bought Uber Elevate from Uber. So when they launch, they're going to be on the Uber app.
Yeah, I've heard of them. I have to agree with you. I mean, as John mentioned, I started a company that we spent a lot of time thinking about this exact problem, 3 years, every single day, venture backed. You know, from having a mobile gym to, you know, a truck or whatever, on-demand cars and all kinds of formats that can transport you, and you're really transporting. Jillian was right. Your time and energy and all kinds of things. And once you're mobile, and you don't have to actually focus on that, you can work. You can have a mobile office. You could have a mobile house. You could have a mobile car. You could have a mobile gym, or not obviously mobile car, but you know, there's different formats, and you can really put anything into that format, and including not even being there in the first place, transporting goods and services and whatnot have you. Like barbers can show up to your house or whatever. So, you know, anyway.
Yeah, it's funny, we were just reminiscing the other day about, you know, those first few months of COVID. We had a CSA share that we had for a couple of years before that, and they switched their model. You know, in the middle of the winter, they wouldn't normally have been growing a whole lot where we are. It's cold here, but they switched their model to start delivering, and so we were getting like home deliveries of just, you know, vegetables and butter and cheese and eggs and things like that. And you know, just how much like COVID showed these other possible models that were like there all along or whatever, but like suddenly there was a space for them to like happen a lot more than, I mean, I know that's not like a completely, I mean, there are obviously like home delivery food things already, but just, I don't know, just the way that it fit into our lives, like in this strange way that we didn't anticipate, you know?
And that granularizes as it goes to robotic and drone delivery if the FAA can get out of our way.
Yeah.
But you know, at the very time we're thinking about more density solutions for cities, we're looking at cities. I mean, and the population outside of Africa is already stabilized. It's already peaked. So, and in other places, it's starting to decline pretty rapidly. So we're, you know, the density problem isn't as big of a problem for what we're seeing. And also we're seeing this emergence of the kind of the virtualization of middle class life, and COVID and other things, staying home more and doing more, so much more at home.
Yeah, I don't want to argue. I don't think it's true that just because population's finally peaking, that density still doesn't win. The point that I'd like to make is there's some really good research, complexity research coming out of the Santa Fe Institute that says denser cities outcompete less dense cities, both for productivity, for sustainability, and for diversity of skill sets.
Okay.
So if you can figure out how to do both, if you can figure out how to virtualize and localize, then you get this kind of double reinforcing effect where, yes, you're doing more things virtually in more contexts, but now you can also get the physical connectivity and the incredible specialist resources that cannot be sustained in the smaller towns. More and more of those get invested in the infrastructure, and you get these crazy, if you look at Singapore, it's like, you know, it's a city of the future, right? And there's examples of that I think we're going to see more and more of that in these densest and most virtualized.
Okay. So let me twist this just slightly, because a lot of these things actually you have those little twists at the end. It's going to say virtual density. Social density is like extreme, let's say on Twitter, right? So we're seeing a kind of a virtual version of a very tight social density, replicating a lot of the features and functionality you would see in a physical sense.
Absolutely. So, I think you're totally right. You know, I think Cesar Hidalgo at MIT.
Let him finish his argument.
Okay, but Cesar Hidalgo at MIT, his 2 books on that topic are exactly that: the virtual density and diversity of the leading networks. Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of a replacement. You know the whole thing about not going faster and faster travel, and then we peaked at you know, the subsonic, and the reason why is that the experience of you know, video conferencing and everything else, you know, was at instant speeds, basically.
You can also make the case to supplement that observation that it was changing sustainability ethics. We finally realized that the loudness, which they could not engineer out, and the wasting of the fuel, those 2 things were just unacceptable to us. The carbon footprint and the the loudness of the sonic booms. Both of those kept it niche and did not allow the SST to become competitive with all the others. So I think these ideas of Musk's space plane and all that, I think they're just ridiculous. They're not going to happen.
Right.
We're going to outcompete with these better and better virtual experiences, and we have this changing sustainability ethic where the local, I think it was Jillian who was talking about with CSAs, this incredible investment in how can we make the local richer and more unique, and we'll do it with these virtualizations that you were talking about. That's what Cesar talks about in his books. Cesar Hidalgo is, like these little tiny towns are going to outcompete a lot of the big towns because they have these really dense specialized networks that are connected up to the larger versions of those around the world, right? So the urban still beats rural, still just completely beats rural, but it's this different kind of urban now. It's this mesh of these little nodes of urban everywhere, right? Here's a fascinating statistic for you from the book Triumph of the City. 3% of space in America hosts 95% of Americans. 3% of space hosts 95% of Americans. That's how dense we're already packed.
But John, that book was written before COVID and before we realized, oh, wow, I can be there and still have this connection. Think about all the people here on this call that are all over the place and wouldn't be able to do that. And Tyler, you wanted to say something?
Right, yeah, but Cesar, before he jumps in, Cesar's point is that those people who flee the city, they flee to these little dense satellite cities. That's his point, is the density stays. The density stays. Tyler?
Yeah. I mean, just part of our project was extending the density of the city. So like, cities are prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. It's really hard for a lot of people to live in the city. And so what we wanted to do is shuttle people from city to city or from, like town to city. And so you could spend your time sleeping while traveling or doing something else while traveling, so that traveling time isn't as painful. And then I would argue too that what we're all talking about maybe is virtual density now. And so you can simulate density with these virtual experiences. But there's still going to be concerts and virtual and summits and all these other things that are, we can talk here, but there's also a lot more connection and what's it called, ideation that happens after this meeting. We go out to coffee and whatever, and so that doesn't happen when you're virtually dense. It only happens when you're actually there.
Right.
I've seen a densification on this, like a hyper densification on the suburban side.
Yeah.
So like, everybody's, the dentists and the doctors and all are staying in that suburban area, and they are jam packed because all of the city doctors have been left, and they're not using any of those restaurants. They're not using the offices, and it's getting extremely dense in the suburban areas, and it's centered around schools. And they walk, the nature walks and everything else, they're all packed all the time now, at least in my area.
It's the walkability is winning, right? We're finding these urban cores, these buffered bike lanes are going into all the walkable cores. They're taking over a few of the streets for walkability. I want to know where that's going to go, 30 years after we have these air taxis. I would hope 5 to 10% of the, parking of the streets, of the parking garages are just converted back to this green space. I don't think it'll be, there's this really, really great YouTube channel. I forget what it's called, but he talks about the missing middle. Have you guys heard about the missing middle?
No.
Nope.
So basically the car culture forced us from high rises to suburbs, and there's no middle of these 10-story, highly, mixed use, highly walkable urban cores. There's no middle in America. There's just suburb sprawl and these high density, and there's all these regulations, zoning regulations that prevent these kind of things you see in a few of our cities like Georgetown, where they have these 12 stories, where there's 10 stories of residence, and then 1 story of
Offices. or
office,
retail.
and then 1 story of retail, right? That kind of thing, where you see certain cities have those, and it's like it's this amazing middle, right? And if you look at Singapore's middle is hugely diverse. They've allowed all these different kinds of things that are in that middle density zone. But in America, we have this missing middle because the car culture just completely took away that the politics around it completely took away developers' ability to create those.
But wait a
It goes
second.
into the legal things that prevent that from being created.
Singapore is a kind of weird model. I was talking to the one of the planners there at it when I went to go visit for some DoD thing, and she was telling me that 70% of the population lives in subsidized housing. So
They do.
I mean,
It's
government-run housing.
tremendously subsidized, and it's very different from one block to the other. It doesn't look like any of that Soviet crap where everything's all the same.
Right.
They allow their developers to do their own thing, and they subsidize it. So it's very much like a Nordic model. There's a lot of similarities to what you see in, say, Finland or Norway to what they're doing with their housing there. And you could.
I mean, last time I was in Singapore is many, many years ago, but it was all high rises and shopping malls, and the only thing that they took me to was like an old market that they preserved, where I had durian for the first time. So that happened in the last 10, 20 years?
No. There's like these 10-story buildings that have everybody packed in, and it's like ethnically managed. So there's like a certain percentage has to be Malay. They can't have any kind of like Islamification. And then in each block, there is like this little stalls of eating where you eat in that little block, and you can go, it's both, you can go down and have all that great food. And then they have the big undercity malls, were mostly underground, and those things sprawl, and you can go from mall to mall to mall underground. And most of those seem, they like to walk in those because it's cool. But the problem is that no one's purchasing like they used to, because they're going to the store, seeing the product, and then buying it online. It's turning into a kind of a branding exercise. So you go there for the brand experience, sit on a couch, see the brand, and then they'll help you order it online. So
Thanks for sharing that, Rob. Yeah, John, sorry. It's so fascinating to see these different ways of doing things, right? Like if you look at biking, where I live here, in the winter, nobody bikes. But if you go to Oulu in Finland, they have bike lanes everywhere and they're constantly plowed, and they go over every overpass. So everybody's biking. They bike to school. They bike to.
I think 70, if not 80% of the kids, even in winter, bike to school.
That's right. They do.
Crazy.
And it's just because they have that zero tolerance for unplowed bike lanes, right? They just jump right out, they clear them all out, and they have this beautiful infrastructure there. So everybody's on their bikes in the middle of winter.
Exactly opposite here, because of stranger danger, nobody bikes. None of the kids even walk. No biking, no walking.
We have no infrastructure for biking, right? Yeah, have a great one, and I look forward to seeing you again.